Hello, everybody. Today, Vassar and
Anastasia Braevich.
will be presenting on anhedonia, motivation, value, and treatments. Burnout. Burnout's a common subset of fatigue, but how is it defined? Burnout is defined as a prolonged response to chronic emotional and interpersonal stressors on the job. It is defined by three dimensions of exhaustion, cynicism, and professional inefficacy. I'm sure most students, such as myself, have heard of and experienced this phenomenon. However, what surprised me is the leading role of stress. When considering phenomena like senioritis, these stressors begin to make sense, as seniors are more inclined to worry about their future, making an individual less inclined to have the mental capacity to focus on schoolwork. How does it affect everyday life? Different studies have associated this phenomena with the development of debilitative symptoms like concentration and memory deficits and low self-esteem, and many others. People with higher levels of burnout are more likely to suffer from a variety of physical health problems, such as cardiovascular disorders and chronic fatigue. Burnout as a form of anhedonia. We posit burnout as a form of anhedonia specifically due to its lack of motivation aspect and lack of subjective energy, general fatigue, and cognitive and physical deficits. And this is particularly true in clinical diagnoses of depression, as depression diagnoses criteria historically consider fatigue and anhedonia as interrelated and interchangeable constructs. What might this mean for individuals with burnout? In this presentation, we'll go over many treatments for anhedonia. Considering burnout as a form of anhedonia, some treatments do an excellent job of alleviating anhedonia, meaning that if an individual with burnout gets treated, their symptoms can begin to be mitigated. If you may be experiencing burnout, pay close attention to the treatment section of our video to learn how to combat symptoms of burnout. So, we'll begin by telling you guys what is anhedonia and why it's important to us. Next, we will get into the causes. Then we'll get into the behavioral effects. And lastly, we will be doing treatments.
So, what is anhedonia? The DSM-5 diagnosis for depression has anhedonia as a markedly diminished interest or pleasure in all or almost all activities. Anhedonia is a core symptom of major depressive disorder, one of the two required in order to achieve a diagnosis. And trait-based anhedonia is where traits are consistent, long-lasting, and internally driven, thought of as a personality trait. An example of this would be never having experienced pleasure at a family gathering. Since you never have, it's not odd that you aren't experiencing it now. State-based anhedonia is what we are currently interested in. States are short-term and caused by external circumstances. A recent lack of motivation to do studies for finals or go to work when you usually have that motivation is abnormal and should be looked into. State-based is the type of anhedonia that's associated with burnout and major depressive disorder. Why is this important? Well, anhedonia is associated with an increased risk of suicide and higher severity of depressive symptoms. Anhedonia is also associated with poor treatment response. Therefore, it is very important to understand when one is suffering from anhedonia so that treatments can be tailored to this specific disorder. Types of anhedonia. Anhedonia is a heterogeneous disorder, like major depressive disorder, which means that multiple causes or etiologies lead to anhedonia. In order to better understand it, anhedonia has recently been split into subtypes by researchers so that the neural correlates and treatments can be better tailored. The first type is consumatory anhedonia, which is characterized by a lack of pleasure or reactivity when participating in activity or receiving a reward. So, for example, that would not be enjoying your favorite food as much, or not being as excited when receiving a present. Anticipatory anhedonia is a lack of pleasure when anticipating future activities or expecting gratification. So, a reduced motivation when thinking of a future event that previously would have brought you pleasure and motivated you to go pursue it. Finally, impaired reward learning, which is reduced error prediction signaling and learning in classical and instrumental conditioning. This is simply when you go to do an action expecting one outcome and you receive a different outcome. In your brain, you code for this new outcome so that next time you can make a more accurate decision. Impaired reward learning is when this encoding does not happen.
Now we posit some key questions for you guys to look out for during this presentation. Number one, What are some primary brain regions involved in anhedonia? Number 2, what are the long-term causes of anhedonia? And number 3, what are some plausible treatments for state anhedonia?
The neurocircuitry of anhedonia. For this presentation, we will be focusing on 3 sections of the brain. First, the orbitofrontal cortex. Second, the anterior cingulate cortex. And third, the ventral striatum. As you can see, these 3 brain regions are connected by dopamine pathways and serotonin pathways that help function reward, pleasure, motor function, compulsion, perseverance, and are hormones that communicate to different parts of the brain. In anhedonia, you see these hormonal pathways being disrupted and causing either too much connectivity or not enough connectivity as would be expected. So, the orbital frontal cortex. The orbital frontal cortex is the part of the brain that receives the what? The what sensory stimuli from other cortical regions, for example, the anterior insula and visual cortex, and integrates current bodily states, such as hunger and thirst, with emotional and social information. The orbital frontal cortex is known to represent a cognitive mind of the environment in relation to one's current goals and predictions, so that when making decision-making functions, you integrate these two. Orbital frontal cortex is associated with anhedonia. Consumatory anhedonia is known to happen along with gray matter volume being reduced in the orbital frontal cortex. Anticipatory anhedonia, which is lack of motivation, happens when there's hyperactivity in the orbital frontal cortex and blunted activity in effort-based tasks. So less motivation to put energy into tasks that take more effort is also associated with a reduced connectivity between the orbital frontal cortex and the striatal regions. Impaired learning is also associated with blunted prediction error signaling. Next, the anterior cingulate cortex. The anterior cingulate cortex is known for decision making and social related processes. It represents expected values. What we mean by that is outcome action associations. That is, when you expect an outcome to happen from an action, you learn that through experience. And this is what the anterior cingulate cortex does. It represents expected values from looking back at experiences, what you think is going to happen. And then from there, you choose that behavior. In anticipatory anhedonia, you see an altered response caused by hyperactivity in the anterior cingulate cortex. Finally, the ventral striatum. This is known as the reward center of the brain or the pleasure center of the brain. It is highly connected to multiple different parts of the brain and as such is associated with anhedonia and symptoms of anhedonia. Consumatory anhedonia is associated with reduced gray matter in the nucleus accumbens, which is a part of the ventral striatum, and a blunted response to pleasant stimuli is associated with a hyperactivity. Anticipatory anhedonia is associated with a reduced gray matter volume, and altered response when anticipating a reward is associated with hypoactivity. Finally, blunted effort-based activity is once again associated with this region and connectivity with the first region, the orbital frontal cortex. As you can see, all of these regions communicate with each other, so one region being blunted or being hyperactive or hypoactive more than usual will feed into other regions and cause a disruption in the regular reward matrix.
Now, let's get into some of the causes of anhedonia. The first cause we look at is chronic stress. And chronic stress is defined as the physiological or psychological response to a prolonged internal or external event. And the stressor may not remain physically present to have its effects, and recollections of it can substitute for its presence and sustains chronic stress. In many studies examined, stress is operationalized as specific stressful life events, objective accounts of lifetime stressors, and subjective ratings of perceived stress. Chronic stress effects on anhedonia. Human research consistently shows that stressful life events impact multiple facets of reward functioning. In one study we looked at, stressful life events, specifically Army Reserve field training and school exams amongst college students, predict lower pleasure as operationalized as reduced positive, effective responses to positive film clips or daily activities. Early life stress in individuals self-reporting chronic stressors appears to preferentially target motivation rather than reward sensitivity. Another study we looked at found that individuals who experience high levels of early life stress showed lower levels of brain activation when they process cues signaling potential loss compared to healthy controls. This may indicate that these individuals are less loss aversive and more willing to engage in risky behaviors due to deficits in neural reward circuitry in anticipation of rewards.
Inflammation-induced anhedonia. So another cause of anhedonia is inflammation. This study here that it looked into whether endotoxins reduce ventral striatum responses to reward aimed to look into the effect of experimentally induced inflammation on the ventral striatum. For this study, there were 39 participants randomly assigned a placebo or an endotoxin. The endotoxin is supposed to cause low-level inflammation of the brain, and the aim of the study was to look into whether inflammation causes a reduction of activity in the ventral striatum in response to reward cues, and whether that is associated with an inflammatory-induced depressed mood. The endotoxin used was administered intravenously. In order to measure the effect of inflammation in the brain, they used cytokines. These are small proteins that control growth activity of immune cells and blood cells, and aid immune and inflammation responses, and help you recover. The specific cytokines being looked into in this study are the tumor necrosis factor and interleukin 6, which are both pro-inflammatory, meaning they cause inflammation, and when they're dysregulated and have an abundance, cause a pathological effect on chronic inflammation and autoimmunity. This study found that ventral striatum activity in the whole brain analysis was significantly more active in the placebo than in the endotoxin, meaning that during inflammation, ventral striatum activity was greatly decreased, as you can see here and down here. Interestingly, decreased ventral striatum activity was associated with higher scores of depression by the experimenters when observing the subjects. In terms of how the ventral striatum was affected when reward was being anticipated, this part of the study looked at neural activity in the region of interest of the two different parts of the ventral striatum. So red is right and blue is left. Participants exposed to the endotoxin had significantly decreased activity in the left ventral striatum when anticipating a monetary reward, meaning that there is anticipatory anhedonia happening in these subjects due to inflammation. Inflammation is also associated with chronic stress, and they can feed into each other.
So now let's get into some potential links between use of social media and anhedonia. Social media use and depression are consistently linked in many studies, particularly amongst adolescent participants. Taken together, the 4 studies listed below demonstrate that overuse of social media, high social media activity, investment of identity-related information, and addiction to social media all lead to depressive outcomes. When taken in conjunction with each other, social media usage demonstrates positive correlations with the development of depression around the world. And for any parents watching, don't jump to conclusions about banning social media usage altogether, as lighter social media usage has shown good mental health benefits. However, do consider the amount of time your child may be spending on social media, as too much time spent may bring about adverse mental health effects. But what about anhedonia? Anhedonia is a significant symptom of depression and has been posited as a subtype of depression. Given the relationship between depression and anhedonia, it can be generalized that social media has some effects on anhedonia. This makes sense. Social media is designed to interact with the brain's reward circuitry in ways that increase user engagement, often making it addicting. This can influence pleasurable activities outside of social media, as an individual may expect easy rewards in the face of a difficult task. Now we get into how does anhedonia interfere with everyday functioning? This study measured objective reward sensitivity and motivation in people with high versus low anhedonia. And the hypothesis was that compared to people with low levels of anhedonia, people with high levels of anhedonia will show reduced reward motivation and reward sensitivity. There were 66 final participants, 34 were low in anhedonia, and 32 were high in anhedonia. Recruitment. Individuals who scored high and low on the Snaith-Hamilton pleasure scale were recruited to participate in the study. Behavioral measures. A modified joystick-operated runway task used to measure reward motivation and effort expenditure for rewards tasks used to measure effort-based decision-making, and the sweet taste test, which measured reward sensitivity, were all used to measure anhedonia. And the primary measure for anhedonia was the SHAPS. As you can see here and here, we did not use the joystick-operated runway task as there was a lack of significance in the analyses. But in the EFRT task, in the low, medium, and high probability of win trials, you can see the differences in proportion of hard choices between low and high anhedonia participants. And when statistical analyses were applied, the differences between groups, however, were insignificant except for one. There was a main effect for the group with high anhedonia. The high anhedonia group chose the hard task significantly less often than the low anhedonia group. Here, the sweet taste test is demonstrated. Each dot represents a particular participant. The high anhedonia group's mean detection threshold is higher and more dispersed than the low anhedonia group. Statistical analyses support this observation, as the mean detection threshold for the high anhedonia group was significantly higher than that for the low anhedonia group. And what are some implications? The EFRT task results demonstrate that individuals high in anhedonia may avoid tasks seen as objectively more difficult. And the results of the sweet taste test suggest that anhedonia is related to reduced reward sensitivity. And this may signify that individuals with anhedonia are less incentivized to complete everyday activities due to diminished responsivity to rewards. Now we get into some of the treatments. Why are antidepressants not sufficient as a treatment of anhedonia? Here are some issues with standard antidepressants. Some individuals develop abnormal physical side effects like skin rashes, headaches, and muscle pain. And most patients develop diminished sexual interests. And this may negatively affect current and prospective romantic relationships. Negative withdrawal effects after discontinuation are extremely common. And these effects include dizziness, loss of coordination, insomnia, and vivid dreams. Delayed onset seems to be extremely important and debilitative, but why might this be? Higher risk of suicide and other deliberate acts of self-harm during the first month of treatment is not uncommon, especially prior to clinical effects onset. And first-line treatments are often ineffective despite optimal treatment being prescribed and adherence being assured. This is ineffective because some patients do not respond to a particular agent. This can lead to a worsening of depression due to rumination and hopelessness regarding treatment efficacy. But what about anhedonia and antidepressants? Anhedonia has been identified as a predictor of poor response to antidepressant medications in adults and youth, as clarified by Anastasia. And accumulating evidence indicates that SSRIs, in particular, fail to treat anhedonic symptoms in depression. And this makes sense as recent evidence verifies the heterogeneity of anhedonia and the presence of subtypes of anhedonia. This would make it even more challenging to treat, especially in conjunction with depression for standard pharmacotherapies. Psychotherapy as a treatment for anhedonia. This study measured longitudinal associations between perceived stress and anhedonia during psychotherapy treatments. Its main hypothesis was that psychotherapy treatment would lead to reductions in both perceived stress and anhedonia. There were 72 total participants, and they completed all 15 weeks of treatment. And they were divided into two groups: the behavioral activation treatment for anhedonia group, which were 38 people, and the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy group, which was 34 people. The behavioral activation treatment for anhedonia provides psychoeducation, structure, and support in goal setting and overcoming behavioral avoidance, while the mindfulness-based cognitive therapy uses mindfulness to facilitate flexible cognitive emotional responses to events and reduce habitual reactions. The Snaith-Hamilton Pleasure Scale was used to measure anhedonia severity, and the Perceived Stress Scale was used to assess chronic stress. Given the longitudinal nature of the study, the PSS and SHAPS responses were collected at baseline, which was week 1, and weeks 4, 8, 12, and 15 of psychotherapy treatment. Now let's get into some of the results. The graph here demonstrates a multiple linear regression model where anhedonia through the SHAPS and perceived stress through the PSS, and the overall treatment relationship is assessed which is both the BATA and MBCT groups. Each dot represents an individual's treatment completers change in symptom severity from pre to post treatment. The line of best fit here demonstrates the treatment-related reductions in anhedonia were accompanied by declines in self-reported perceived stress. Overall, psychotherapy treatment led to significant decreases in both anhedonia severity and perceived stress. The results indicate that both forms of psychotherapy are a strong candidate for the treatment of anhedonia and chronic stress.
Other treatments for anhedonia. As Vasilis has already gone over, cognitive behavioral therapy is, as we propose, one of the first bases that you should go if you're looking for help with anhedonia or depression or any mood disorders in general. It is a psychotherapy concerned with understanding thought patterns, attitudes, and expectations, and works on changing behavioral patterns. 2. Increasing sleep. Reduced sleep quality and short sleep duration is actually associated with anhedonia. Therefore, if you're trying to prevent anhedonia or mediate the effects of anhedonia, keeping to a consistent sleep schedule with more than 8 hours of sleep per night is one way that you can help treat it. Exercise. There is currently a plethora of research coming out about the benefits of exercise to do with anhedonia. It has been shown to have a moderate to large effect of improvement of symptoms in clinical trials in terms of when you are doing consistent exercise. And this is not just intense exercise, it's from running to stretching. So if you can stay consistent, choose something that is within your ability, it has been shown in research to be quite effective in mediating symptoms. Now, if you don't feel the ability to be able to get yourself up out of bed, dressed all the way to cognitive behavioral therapy or exercise, mindfulness meditation is a good way to start doing small treatments. Mindfulness meditation has been found to decrease burnout resulting from chronic stress in nurses. All this is taking a moment to meditate and being mindful of yourself and your surroundings and taking time to process that. In the study, the participants did 45 minutes. You do not have to do that. We recommend starting with 5 minutes. Anything is better than nothing.
So, why does anhedonia exist when it is maladaptive? In order to understand the analytical rumination hypothesis posited here, we first need to understand what rumination itself is. Rumination refers to recurrent and persistent thinking about a depressive episode and its circumstances. As a thought pattern, it contributes to the development of depression and the worsening of depressive symptoms. The analytical rumination hypothesis states that depression is an evolved adaptation that served in our evolutionary past to keep people focused on complex interpersonal problems until they could arrive at a resolution resembling spontaneous remission. In this sense, rumination facilitates thinking through whatever problems brought about the depressive episode in the first place. In a social context, in our evolutionary past, social ostracism was akin to death. So analytical rumination in this context could help reconcile the group and inform future responses to threats of social exclusion. In this hypothesis, rumination is viewed as a problem-solving process via deep analytical insight. However, what does this mean for the development of anhedonia? For anhedonia specifically, if a person is unable to resolve complex social problems, then anhedonic cause deficits in motivation, goal-directed behavior, and reward processing point to the need to resolve the pressing social problem before they can continue as a part of the in-group and revert to baseline reward functioning. If rumination was adaptive in an evolutionary sense, why is it maladaptive in a modern context? The hypothesis relies on depression being state-based, as state-based depression is more likely to be attributable to a salient cause. For trait-based depression with no apparent cause, analytical rumination seems difficult. Analytical rumination in a problem-solving context relies on an attributable cause of depressive states. Nonetheless, the hypothesis demonstrates that rumination was once vital for an individual's survival in the group, making it adaptive. Links between rumination and anhedonia. It has been commonly hypothesized that rumination causally contributes to anhedonia. And research shows that rumination is a predictor of anhedonic depression. Recent studies that support this idea that rumination and anhedonia are related processes in clinically depressed individuals makes the analytical rumination hypothesis significantly more plausible as an evolutionary correlate of anhedonia in a depression context. Thank you for listening, guys.
Yes, thank you.